Okay, I'd like to officially welcome folks to the engineering seminar for this afternoon. I'm David Wonder. I'm Dean for Faculty Development and Research Initiatives and also Professor in the Engineering Department. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for the day. Dr. Jennifer Van Antorp joined the engineering faculty in 1999. She has taught a great variety of courses and is in the chemical engineering concentration, so teaches in the upper level chemical engineering concentration, as well as lower level engineering courses. She is known by faculty and students as someone who loves learning and also loves to see and make connections with engineering work and God's kingdom. She earned her PhD and Masters of Science in Chemical Engineering from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and her Bachelor's of Science in Chemical Engineering from Michigan State University. She's done applied research in areas that bridge biology and engineering, and she's also had significant work experience in industry with local engineering firms, with a global firm, Pfizer, and with her PhD work as well. Her current and recent research and scholarship for a while now has focused on engineering career pathways, including workforce retention and diversification, and her publications have focused on how gender interacts with engineering culture and career outcomes. She's also published in the areas of curriculum development, engineering student retention, and gender issues in engineering. Her current project, the importance of her work was highlighted in a 2018 National Academies report around sexual harassment in academia, the medical community, and technical fields, including primarily engineering. And this is from that report. The engineering community has been working for decades to increase the representation of women in universities and in the profession, but progress has been slow. In the United States, just 21% of engineering bachelor's degrees go to women, so that's 2018, and only 11% of practicing engineers are women. So 21% of the degrees, 11% of those who practice. While the problem is complex, we must, that's the community, we must recognize that one significant factor is sexual harassment, which creates hostile education and work environments and pushes women out of the field. So for the past 3 years or so, Dr. Van Antorp has made great progress on a book that addresses that very need. It's a seminal work that looks at the situation, provides a literature review, an extensive review of what's been done so far around the concern and problem with sexual harassment in engineering, and also presents ways to address it effectively. And those aren't ways just for those that are sexually harassed. It's for the entire community. So it's with great pleasure that I welcome Dr. Jennifer Van Antorp.
Well, good afternoon. Thanks, David. And thanks to all of you for giving up your afternoon to hear a little bit about this, because this has been obsessing me for the last 2 or 3 years, but maybe it's new to you, and so I appreciate you taking some time to hear about it. So this book, I want to start with this quote from an academic article a few years ago. We have all these K-12 STEM efforts. Let's get the girls excited about science. And at this point, said an engineering professor who was being interviewed about her sexual harassment experiences, at this point, a lot of us feel like, why would you do that to them? That struck me when I read that journal article, right? Because here I am, I've given my life to becoming an engineer, and I'm excited about engineering. I like being an engineer, and I'm excited about educating more engineers. And I read this and I thought, am I doing the wrong thing? Am I setting people up for something they don't deserve? And so I really had to take a good look and think about what's going on. But this is a negative way to start. And I'd like to assure you that before I'm done, I will have turned that a little bit, hopefully to a more positive look. So here are the two authors. You see myself. My co-author, Denise Wilson, is a professor of engineering in Seattle, University of Washington. We have been working together for a little over 10 years now. We met at the Christian Engineering Education Conference, and we discovered that we had some common interests, and so we've been collaborating for a number of years now. We kind of came together around this question that we both were dying to know. And for those of you younger folks in the audience, that's really what research turns out to be, right? You get to a question that you just really want to know the answer to, and nobody seems to know, and so you go try to figure that out. And we kept stumbling across this question everywhere we went. It's no surprise that there are fewer women in engineering. We kind of all know that. But people kept asking me, why is that? Why are there fewer women in engineering? And I talked to engineering educators, and I talked to engineering students, and I talked to people working in engineering, and I talked to my next door neighbor, and everybody had a theory. Everybody had an idea, but none of those answers were very satisfying to me, and frankly, to the people I was talking to either. We all just kind of had an inkling, but we really wanted to know, could we better understand what was going on? And so it led to this work as we started trying to figure it out. So why this book and why now? Quite frankly, this is not the book that either one of us wanted to write. We were excited to write a book about the research we were already doing that was very positive focused on all the ways we were going to make the culture better. And the further we went, the more we discovered that we had to write this book first. We had to get it out of the way. Some of you are out there thinking about your core education classes, right? Like, I got to get those out of the way. No, that's not right. Those are great classes, but this is not great stuff. We've got to get this out of the way so that we can make forward progress on the stuff we really want to do. So this is the kind of research that Denise and I were doing. All those things on the left, those green circles, those are good things that we can provide in a workplace. And if we can provide those things, we find that we get happy employees, more people want to work there, more people want to keep working there. We know how to do this. It's in the psychology literature, and it's been tested in all kinds of workplaces, including engineering, so we know it works. And in fact, our research, the research of others in the publications tell us we get all kinds of great outcomes if we can provide the things in green. We get all kinds of things in blue. And those benefits apply to the individuals, and they also apply to the organization as a whole. And of course, that means that they apply to society as a whole. So this is something that we all have a vested interest in. This is not just a diversity type of initiative that we can ignore because we don't think it applies to us. We want those things for all of society. But then, as we were doing this work, doing the positive things we wanted to do, this happened. Does anyone recognize that? 2017, this is called the tweet heard round the world. Alyssa Milano is an actress who tweeted this 10 days after the New York Times broke a story about horrific sexual harassment that had happened over years in the entertainment industry by Harvey Weinstein. And Alyssa Milano spoke out and said, it's not something that's happened to a few people. It happened to me. Did it happen to you? And tens of thousands of women responded within hours. And the answer around the world was yes. In fact, it went global, those tweets, by the end of the day. And so as we thought about the reaction to this, Denise and I got talking about the issue in general. We have had really different experiences within engineering. I'm a chemical engineer, which is one of the fields with the most women. She's an electrical engineer, which is the field with the least women. We've both worked in academia, we've both worked in industry, but in different kinds of places. And so we talked about our different conversations, and really our conversations over the next few years developed into the book proposal that we're writing here. And so we talked about it, and we said we've got this huge push for engineering diversity. We've got this huge push for a more productive and creative workplace. And we know all the things that make that happen, but what we're seeing is that sexual harassment puts the gate down. We can never get to any of those things and make them effective. And so neither Denise or I really wanted the focus to be on sexual harassment, but we can't do anything good until we get past that. So it is a necessary but not sufficient condition for a thriving workplace where we all want to be. So I don't want any of you here to leave with the impression that this is all there is to know about a good workplace, right? I would hope that you get to have a career where you never see this at all, and you never have to worry about it, and you can start 3 steps up, and you can just develop a thriving workplace. But if that's not the case, we need to know how to have something different. All right, so who did we have in mind as an audience when we wrote this book? It is an academic book. We were writing it for researchers who may be social scientists writing about sexual harassment. They may be engineering educators writing about engineering workplace or university culture. But it wasn't supposed to be just for academics. We also wanted to write directly to engineers, whether that be engineering students like yourself or to engineers in the workplace. We want this to be accessible. And I'll be honest with you, there's a lot of footnotes in this book. It reads a little bit like somewhere between a research article and a textbook. But some chapters are a little less thick than others because we need the technical background for the researchers, but we also want to speak directly to the people who are looking to apply it. So who else is this for? Well, it's important to say who we probably didn't write this book for. And that's this very small number of people who I would call the habitual and hostile harassers. That's actually a really small number. I don't think any of them would choose to read this book, and I think if you forced them to read this book, it wouldn't make any difference. So I don't have those people in mind at all. It wasn't worth our time to address that. But I think it is worth talking about the handful of people that I would put in the category of the unintentional harassers. So these are people who, if you pointed out to them that what they were doing had a negative impact on their coworkers or their other students, they would be horrified. But they don't realize that that's happening necessarily. And so it's important, I think, for this group of people to understand, first of all, what harassment looks like. It doesn't all look like Harvey Weinstein in the newspaper. In fact, almost none of it does. And it's also important for these people to understand, what does harassment feel like to the person who's being harassed, and frankly, to the people around as well. Because in order to make some changes, you need to understand what it is and why it's important to make those changes. And so the approach we took here, when we think about helping people understand someone else's perspective, is story, right? We all know story is the best way to learn perspective and to understand about how to change our behavior or why it's important. And so there is a strong element of story. I told you there's a lot of footnotes, but we also have a lot of what I would call vignettes, where we've told a story in a few paragraphs. Some of those are direct quotes out of the media or out of research literature. Some of those are compilations. We've kind of taken our own experiences, our own reading, people we've talked to, and written a story that's representative. But we did try to keep a lot of that in there. See if my remote just died. It's bound to happen. There we go. We also wrote this book for those who are being harassed. And we think it's important for those being harassed, especially because of some particular elements in the culture of engineering, for these people to feel validated that what they're experiencing is harassment, it is not appropriate, it is not okay, and they have a right to say something about it and to ask for it to stop. Frankly, this happens to anyone who's in a harassing situation, but I think it's especially true because of a variety of features of the culture of engineering that people are going to respond with things like, well, it's really not that bad, or, well, I'm overreacting, I probably misinterpreted what happened there, or, well, you know, what can you expect? There's really no way to have a better situation on the manufacturing floor, that's just kind of how things are. So we'd like to also present story for this group of people, a chance for them to recognize what's happening, name it, and accept their story, be able to tell their own story and own it for themselves, which I think is an important part of both their own healing and being able to share with others. But finally, we wrote this book for, I would call, the vast majority of people in the engineering world. And I want to make that clear. I think this is most people sitting out here, most people that you're going to be working with. And those are people who are wanting things to be good. They treat people around them with basic respect and basic dignity. These are people with the right intentions and the right actions, and yet they recognize that things are not always right in the culture they're in, and they want to make changes. And so for this group, we've tried to provide in the book what I would call strategy. There are concrete things that we can do. There are things being done in engineering culture that are frankly not at all effective. Some of you have experienced those. But there are things that are known to be more effective, and we'd like to share some of that. So we hope that a variety of people will find parts of the book useful, whether you're an academic researcher, a student, or working in human resources, whatever your role might be. Briefly, I'm not actually able to cover a 300-page book very well in 40 minutes. And I told some people it's like choosing my favorite child to figure out which section. Some of my kids are right here. Thank you, children. I appreciate you being here. But even the ones who aren't here are still my favorites. So I picked a few of these, but I want you to get a little sense of the scope. And in particular, we're not going to talk much about recent events. But I think the social context that we find ourselves in the last 5 years, really kind of since that Me Too moment, is different than what we've ever seen before. And I think that impacts what people are experiencing, and it impacts how people are reacting to it. And it's important that we put that lens around things that we're looking at. All right, now I'm about halfway done, and I still haven't actually defined for you what is sexual harassment. I'm guessing that each of you has an idea in your mind about what that is. And probably what you have in mind is, in fact, sexual harassment, but it's probably not the complete picture. So it tends to be broader than what most people think. To be honest, it's not a silly question. Before I started reading this book, I didn't really know. I had the wrong idea, too. And is it really that bad? Well, you know, I kind of had the wrong idea about that, too. I thought, yeah, you know, that's the way things are. You heard me say that, right? And that's part of the engineering culture as well, that you put up or you shut up. That's just kind of what it's like. So big picture, the law of sexual harassment starts with a couple of important laws. Maybe you've heard Title VII of the Civil Rights Act from a number of years ago. That's what talks about employment discrimination. And in that employment discrimination, sex or gender is one protected class where you can't discriminate against people because of their sex. And Title IX is the comparable law that applies to an educational institution like here for students. Now, I'm going to just say a quick word about my language. Sex and gender, I understand, are not the same word. And I talk about that in a little more depth in the book, but all the law language is written about sex because that was the word that they used in the 60s and 70s when these laws were written. And since then, the courts have come to define that term sex to mean a lot of things that we understand today, to encompass more things to do with gender. And I will sometimes use sex and gender interchangeably, simply because that's kind of the common language that we're using. But if you want to mince words with me, I'm happy to go into more depth, or you can look at how I handle that in the book as well. So what are the pieces? I should back up a moment. I told you there's discriminatory behaviors in the outer ring in general. Then there is, see if I can actually get, no battery at all. Within all discrimination, there is sex-based discrimination, and then the darker blue inside that represents the kinds of discrimination that we would call sexual harassment. So you can discriminate based on gender because you pay someone differently or you won't hire women, but that's not sexual harassment, that's sex discrimination. Sexual harassment is a particular subset of that. And so if we were to look at kind of types of sexual harassment, I've lined my bubbles up. The ones at the bottom we would probably consider the most severe types of actions, but they're also really the least frequent occurrences. So there is a difference from top to bottom that way. In the middle, I've named these types of harassment the way that researchers name them. So if you read anything in the literature about what is harassment and what are the effects of harassment, those are the terms that have been decided upon, and I'll define those in a moment. On the right, my point is just that there is a different set of language that's used in the law. And so if you were to bring a lawsuit related to sexual harassment, the terms and the standards of proof and a number of different things are different. I'm not talking about that. Again, if you're really interested in that, it's a fascinating history. I have to give a nod to my aunt and uncle. Thank you for coming. My aunt and uncle, who are attorneys, because I got totally lost in the law journals writing this chapter, and it was fascinating. And Denise kept telling me, stop, that's not the chapter, that doesn't make our whole book. But if you want to know more about the history of the law and how that interacts with it, I'd be happy to talk about it. But we're going to focus on the research because that's the part that really impacts how people experience harassment and what it does. So at the bottom, we have this sexual coercion and bribery. That's the Harvey Weinstein stuff that we're familiar with. Do this or else, or do this if you want that. That's fortunately pretty rare, but it's also, it happens. The green in the middle is the unwanted sexual attention. So that is, you're not making someone a threat or an offer, but you are pestering them, and pestering is probably too light a word there. The important thing here, and I think it's a lot of misinterpretation of, well, what, I can't even ever ask my coworker out on a date? Like, that seems weird. Well, I mean, the short answer is it's probably better not to in general, but check your employment policy handbook, your company's, because that's separate. Totally apart from the law, your policy handbook for your company may have rules about how you can disclose relationships with coworkers and so forth. But the real key here is that this is unwanted sexual attention. So actually, it's fine to ask your coworker out on a date. But if your coworker says no, it is not fine to then continue to ask them on a date or comment on their appearance or whatever that might be over and over again, because now you've just crossed the line into harassment. And then the one at the top is actually by far the most common, and that's what we call gender harassment. And this is not harassing an individual person, even though that one person might be the one who receives the harassment. The target is really the whole gender. And so it's hostility towards the gender, and it can show up as the crude behaviors. You've probably seen these ideas, like the classic when I was young was the centerfold pinups in the office. I don't know if they even print magazines anymore, so I guess now it would be the crude emails that you send to your coworkers, which I hope none of you have ever seen and never will. It can also be sexist gender harassment, which is just putting down the other sex, saying they're not as worthy, they're not as good, and it certainly can go both ways in terms of whatever that gender is. All right, so this one, I'm going to skim through a little bit because it's not a very satisfying answer. I don't have a number to tell you how often do people get harassed. I do have numbers, but they're not all that consistent. One of the problems with measuring how much harassment happens is it matters a lot how you ask the question, and it matters a lot who you ask the question of. And so you can read lots and lots of surveys, research studies, whatever that is, and you won't get completely consistent numbers in terms of the absolute value. One example is if you ask someone, have you ever been sexually harassed? Or if you ask someone, have you ever experienced a sexist comment? You'll get very different answers. People will say, oh yeah, I hear sexist comments all the time, But they would say, no, I've never been sexually harassed. And that has to do with labeling, right? We tend not to name those things as sexual harassment. And that's fine, except that those experiences tend to still have those negative impacts on us. And so those are different things that we're measuring. And then, of course, the other thing is, are we measuring it for engineering? Are we measuring it for the high-tech industry and workers? Are we measuring it for STEM, or are we measuring it for all professional workers? So all those things vary. So I don't even necessarily want you to read all of those right now or at all. They're in the book. But my point, I'm just going to sum those up. You can see different numbers for all different kinds of groups of people, for men, for women, together. We'll come back to a summary of those in a minute. The other thing is, in addition to how much harassment happens, there's a question of, is harassment reported? Because people can say, well, there's no reports of harassment at my company, so I don't know what you're talking about. There's no sexual harassment going on here. Well, it turns out that people don't tend to report harassment within their companies. They're more likely to report it to their own management than they are to report it to human resources, but still you can see fewer than half will make any report within their own companies. And actually men, when they're harassed, are much less likely to report it, and that seems to be because there's more stigma attached to a man being sexually harassed because of sort of that sense that, well, that really unmans me in a sense, right? That I could have been the target of this. But it does happen, so it's important to understand. And then those legal claims that everyone worries, I'm going to be sued. The EEOC itself that handles the legal claims did a study and determined that only 0.18% of people who believed they had been harassed ever filed a legal claim. So it's not like people are just out there looking for lawsuits, and it makes it a little hard to track those claims through the EEOC and have any idea how much harassment's going on. But also important is that studies have shown that engineering students are the least likely group out of everybody on a university campus to report sexual harassment. And by report, I mean the least likely to report it, not the least likely to experience it. So if you look at someone who says, yeah, I've experienced it, talking to a researcher, and you compare that to, did you tell someone in the university about it? Did you make an official report? Engineering students are less likely than any other group on campus, any group of employees, any other group of students, even STEM students as a whole. Engineering students are less likely. And I think that has something to do with engineering culture as a whole. But here's the summary that I want to go to. We know that harassment, from all the various numbers, however they're collected, it is significantly underreported. We know that there's way too much sexual harassment going on for anyone, whoever you are. We know that women are sexually harassed more than men, and we know that women in the tech or engineering fields are sexually harassed more than women in other fields. So regardless of the numbers, we see that those things are true. That's a mess, I understand that. So that's the academic journal reporting of what sexual harassment looks like. That's a model. So you're engineering, you know, engineers, you understand models, right? We build models to try to represent reality, and we recognize that our models are not perfect. We make some assumptions and some approximations, but they allow us to get our minds around understanding a reality in the world so that we can do something with it. So this is a psychology model, and it's a lot messier than an engineering model because people don't behave as nicely as the things that we like to study in engineering. But the point here is that there are different antecedents, things that come ahead in the green, that impact how likely it is that sexual harassment is going to occur in a setting. And they depend on the organization where you are, and they depend on the individual who's there. And then the red these are all the things that happen because harassment has occurred. These have an individual focus. This is what happens to the individual who is harassed. But I want to focus first on these issues. So the organizational context, that is, where is the place that we're talking about? Is it Calvin University Engineering Department? Is it IBM? Is it lost all my another engineering company? You guys can fill that in for me. Where is harassment less likely to happen? Well, it turns out that if you're in an organization where these two things are true, harassment is way less likely to happen. So these are what researchers call coworker solidarity and supervisor harmony. And if you look at it, that's not very surprising, is it? Those are fancy research terms that say if you work with people where you all feel like you're part of the same team and you all have an obligation to support each other and the whole team works together for success, or if you have a supervisor who believes his or her job is to support their team members and to empower them to be effective and successful, guess what? There's a lot less harassment going on. So it's not rocket science what we need. It gets trickier to figure out how to make that happen in your organization. But it turns out that if your organization has what we call a permissive workplace culture, that more than anything else far outweighs the likelihood that there will be harassment. That permissive culture means a place where harassment is not taken seriously. When harassment occurs, there's not really a good way to report it. Or if there is reporting, there's not really any repercussions. Or if there are repercussions, they're hush-hush and no one ever knows what happened. And there's often retaliation for the person who reported that in the first place. And people believe it's not that big a deal anyway, it doesn't really cause any harm. If you're in such an organization, you have your work cut out for you. But you also have an incredible opportunity to make an impact there. And so I hope that you will be gathering at this point in your life strategy and gathering fortitude so that you have the ability to make that impact should you encounter it. This is no surprise. We know that there tends to be more men in engineering than women. I just find this graph interesting. The percentage women undergraduate students is what I'm plotting here on the y-axis, and that's time, the year that the bachelor's degree was awarded. And you'll see my numbers up at the top don't quite agree. The number of working engineers, Professor Wonder mentioned 11% a few years ago. 15% was the US Census Bureau number. That goes up and down a little bit based on who we're counting as an engineer. Do we include the engineering managers and so forth? But about 15% of working engineers are men right now, and about 22% of engineering undergraduates. But that's an interesting point in time. Anyone here who's old enough might know what happened in 1972. Look and see who's old enough to know. Who knows what happened in 1972? Title IX. It turns out that before 1972, a lot of engineering schools wouldn't actually accept women students. And so in 1972, they were required to do so. And look what happened over the next generation. Miraculously, women became more interested in engineering, right? I love that answer. Well, women just aren't as interested in engineering, so what are we going to do about it? Well, it turns out that culture matters. If you let people study engineering, you might find out that some of them are more interested. Okay, point one. But then over a generation, we hit this 20%, and then look what's happened. Nothing's budged. And that's not true in other STEM fields. Medicine, biology, mathematics, they're all approaching 50% women, but engineering's gotten stuck. And for me, that's a clue that there's something going on, and I think that harassment might be something that is a part of that. So this gets at that second piece that matters in terms of how much harassment we have, the organization, culture, but also what we call the job-gender context, which is it's an aspect of how masculine a workplace is. So we have two kinds of job-gender context. The first is numerical. Take a head count. How many men versus how many women? If there's more men in a setting, there tends to be more harassment, statistically speaking. The second is what we call normative male dominance. That means in a setting, the expectation is that people will be male or will show masculine traits and behaviors. And that is the understanding of what the right person in that place looks like. And if you're not that person, then you should at least behave that way. And so if either of these things exist in a setting, there tends to be more harassment. But it turns out that in engineering, of course, both of these exist in most engineering settings, and they do work together and they feed on each other and you get more of each. But what are some of the mechanisms that we know this happens by? When you have numerical dominance, when we have more men, we get more of what we call that SHMA is sexual harassment myth acceptance. That's the idea that we think harassment is rare and it's overreported. We think it's probably the fault of the victim most of the time. They were asking for it somehow, or they were overreacting. And if you are sexually harassed, it's not a big deal. It doesn't really cause that much harm. And in research, it does turn out that men are slightly more likely than women to display sexual harassment myth acceptance. And so if you have more men, by nature, you can expect more of that culture. The interesting thing is, though, that it's really easy to change this. If you simply spend a little bit of time in what we call empathy training, also known as perspective taking, teaching people to look at it from someone else's point of view, those gender differences completely disappear. Not that hard if we would take the time to do it. And the other thing that you see is when you have a normative culture that's male, we have something called gender policing. And that means that we have norms of how we think a certain gender should behave, and if you're not doing that, we will punish you for it. That's the culture. And so in those situations, women who are showing more masculine traits will be punished for that with harassment, but also if there are men in that setting who display what we would consider less masculine traits, they will also be punished for that. And so you'll see sexual harassment for both of those situations. Particularly hard for women engineers in a sense with gender policing. Well, true for both, really. If you're showing more feminine traits, then you aren't taken as seriously as a woman in general. But if you're showing more masculine traits, then you're punished for not looking feminine. So you're a little bit of a catch-22 there. So here is an example of what a permissive organizational culture looks like, also in the context of sexual harassment myth acceptance. This was a former software engineer, worked at Uber before she quit. And what she said was, I expected that I would report him to HR, they would handle the situation appropriately, and then life would go on. Unfortunately, things played out quite a bit differently. When I reported the situation, I was told by both HR and upper management that yes, this was in fact clearly sexual harassment. He was propositioning me. But they said, well, it was the man's first offense, and they didn't really feel comfortable giving him anything other than a warning and a stern talking to. And so upper management told this woman, well, he was a high performer. He had great performance reviews, in other words, and they really wouldn't feel comfortable punishing this man for what was probably just one innocent mistake on his part. That's kind of a plausible sounding story, right? Do you see how this feels to the woman in this situation? Now you're feeling a little guilty, like, oh, it was probably just one mistake. Maybe I misinterpreted it, or maybe it was a bad day, but yeah, we don't want to ruin his whole career. Well, it turns out that after she left Uber, she started being contacted by other women. It was not his first offense. HR lied to her, point blank. He had been reported multiple times, but he was a high performer. They didn't want to lose him, so they lost her instead, and she went on to have a fabulous career, by the way, at another organization, and she also started a nonprofit to deal with sexual harassment. She's got a book out as well, if you're interested. We can also look at the impacts, but I think I'm just going to leave it with this quote. This is an associate professor of engineering in a research study talking about her harassment experience. You know, I try to think of myself as being a strong person, but it definitely had an impact on me, and I was embarrassed that it had such an impact on me, too. I was mortified that I had broken down in tears because it was kind of difficult for me. I was mortified and embarrassed that I let it have such an impact on me. So the first thing I want to say to each of you is when it happens to you, it's okay to feel that way. It's appropriate to feel that way. I have not had devastating experiences. I have had isolated incidents by people that I didn't know very well because I happen to have great colleagues that I work with here on a daily basis. but I've interacted with people in more loose connections, and I still feel horrible. It was not earth-shattering in my whole career, but I remember the things that happened to me 15 years ago, and those same emotion floodings come back to me when I think about them after 15 years. I get that same response. So quickly, are women just too sensitive or maybe overreacting? This is an important piece of information out of the research literature. This is from what we call a meta-analysis. So the researchers actually looked at 49 different studies of sexual harassment. So the total number of people looked at was 89,000 people. So from that, you can do a lot of higher level statistics and get some real statistical power. And so gold and purple represent men and women. And on the vertical axis, we have a whole number of outcomes associated with having been sexually harassed. Some of them are bad things on the right, and it turns out if you're sexually harassed, you have more of those bad things, like you tend to withdraw from your job, or you tend to withdraw from your work on a daily basis. And guess what? If you start not showing up and putting in the same effort on a daily basis, your career doesn't do well, and your work group doesn't do well, and your company doesn't do well. On the bottom, we have good things like better physical health, better commitment to your job, and you have less of those when you've been sexually harassed. But the other thing I want you to notice is there's no significant difference for those impacts felt by men or women when they are harassed. And also, it's true that the harassment affects the entire organization. The people who witness harassment, who are not the offenders and not the targets, that still creates an ambient stress that affects their job satisfaction. It affects their team performance overall. So there's a company cost to it. So you're not doing any favors to yourself or your company or your work group by deciding it's easier to just stick your head in the sand. If it's not you, you still have an important job to intervene. And I think engineering culture, there are some particular features of engineering culture that make sexual harassment more likely, and they also make it harder to deal with. The macho culture, get over it, put up with it, I'm guilty of that one. So I've been in engineering a long time. And like I said, I haven't had terrible experiences, but my kids will confirm that I'm a fairly non-sympathetic person, am I not? So I say, I'm empathetic, I understand what you're feeling, but I'm sorry, you should get over it, it's not that bad. That's my personality. That is not very helpful if I'm the engineering manager, however. It's not my job to tell you how bad it is, what you're feeling. What you're feeling is your job and your right to interpret, and it's my job as your coworker, as your supervisor, to do something about it. And remember, all of sexual harassment has to do with how does it make you feel. If it makes you feel bad, then it's inappropriate. It's not someone else's job to decide that. And also I think that this one all the way to the right is a problem. Nobody wants to be punished for reporting harassment, but in engineering, you know this, all of your work is done on these complex teams, and it's not just the 3 or 4 people you work with, it's the people in manufacturing who have to carry out the work you're doing, right? And it's your vendors, and it's your customers, and it's your clients, and you really can't afford to damage those relationships and keep doing your job. So you're really in kind of a conundrum when you find yourself facing this harassment. And this is why I think it's so important that we're all working together as a team to change the culture. And I did blow it. I get so excited about stuff, and then I go on, and then I run out of time. But I did say, Me Too. What did we find out from that? Good news is that these more severe forms of harassment, the physical stuff, the coercion, the assault, has definitely gone down since Me Too. That's great news, and we should celebrate that. Unfortunately, gender harassment appears to be increasing. Whether you call that a backlash, whether you call that more awareness of what it was going on, we are seeing more of it. And we are seeing more gender discrimination in the sense that so there's good things. People say, I recognize harassment, I feel less stigma if I am harassed. I'm less likely to harass. But for example, the one that might concern me and the red are the third and fourth line down. Both men and women said they would probably be more reluctant to hire attractive women since Me Too, because it might put them in a precarious position as an employer. And they would be more reluctant to hire women for jobs that might have close contact with men, like a lot of travel, for example. That's discrimination. Full stop. And people are admitting, yeah, I'll probably do that because of Me Too. I don't know what to tell you about that, except it's out there, and it's our job to change it, right? All right, and I do have to get to some solutions before I quit. So there are solutions. I've got a whole chapter of them. Actually, it's really Denise's work, and I was just the cheerleader for this chapter. But all those things we talked about, what do we do now to try to improve sexual harassment? Mostly we do that one bubble, sexual harassment training. And I don't know if any of you have had sexual harassment training, like with an internship. Anyone here? Hands? What'd you think of it? Like thumbs up, medium, thumbs down? How did it change your feeling about harassment and your likelihood to be a harasser? Yeah, pretty much it's a thumbs down for everyone, right? What do you learn from that? It's probably a PowerPoint that you clicked through and took a quiz at the end to prove that you did it. And you know why you do that? It's a legal protection for the company, because it turns out if you do bring a lawsuit, the way case law has gone is the company really only has to prove that they have a procedure in place to deal with it, and then they're okay. They don't actually even have to prove that that procedure is effective. They just have to prove they have a procedure. And so they have a PowerPoint, and you click through, and you check off that you were trained. All right. We'd like to see harassment training that's actually effective, and there are ways to do better training. As an educator, I can assure you there are better ways to teach people, and so that's something that can be done. We need to do more bystander training, which is all the people, like we talked about, who are the good folks, who want a better situation but don't know what to do about it when they see their coworker being harassed. So you need to have, it's similar to bully training in schools. When you see it, what do you do about it? If you have things ready, you'll do better. Now, these last two are kind of like, well, duh, but civility training, teaching people to be nice to each other. Really, we actually have ways to do that, and unfortunately, we kind of need to do that. If we could teach people to be respectful and treat each other with dignity, then all these problems start to go away. But there is such a thing. And so if your company's not doing it, ask about whether they could be doing that instead. And then I talked about the empathy training, teaching people perspective taking. Phenomenal impact, much more than a sexual harassment PowerPoint. And then those two blue bubbles have to do with things that are probably more in the realm of management, but you could still have an impact on the culture. The last bubble there, the gold, is what if you're not a manager? Hopefully you can influence culture through all the things we've talked about, but when you're in a really bad situation and there's no response from management, sometimes your only choice is what we call employee activism, and that has exploded in the media in the last couple of years. We have seen walkouts, right, at Google. We saw walkouts at Blizzard Activision. A lot of these large high-tech companies in particular, the employees finally said, enough. We've tried to go through all the official channels. You're not doing anything about it. We're on strike until you fix things. I'm going to skip this because I'm out of time, but I did want to tell you this was a very powerful story that showed up in the New York Times literally 3 weeks before my manuscript was due at the publisher. And I had to rewrite my entire last chapter because it was the perfect story of how things could be and should be. So now you have a teaser to actually go read the last chapter. It's a story about what happened to one intern and how her coworkers responded, and instead of being a disaster, it changed her entire feeling about the career and everything. Not that she was glad she had the experience, but she was ready to continue her career at that company after her internship. I still get choked up just thinking about it. It's such a beautiful story. What do I want to end with? Most engineers are really nice people. That's you guys. I trust that you're nice people and you want to do the right thing, and most of your coworkers are going to be nice people. And frankly, we're all problem solvers. And so what I hope this book will do is provide some tools, some resources to creative problem solvers who want to do the right thing. And what I start and end the book with is the problem of sexual harassment in engineering is pervasive. It's there, but it is not intractable. We can change the story, and I hope that you'll be part of that. I appreciate that. Before I let you go, I have one important little plug. This is the research we really wanted to do when we started writing this book, and I told you we had to write this book. We're trying to figure out what's going on in engineering and computer science workplaces that's good. And so we want to hear about people's experiences. If you've worked an internship, if you've worked a job, the only thing we're not taking is academic research. That's been studied a lot more. But if you've worked a job in engineering, we'd love to have you fill out our survey and enter the next phase of hopefully positive-looking research. There's flyers outside if you want to just take that and think about it. And I'm supposed to do Q&A, but I'm running out. Sorry, David, go ahead. Running out of time.
So very quickly, the book is for sale just outside that door, and Dr. Van Antorp will be there to take on follow-on questions. But we do have time for some questions from the audience. And so I think I'm going to excuse myself from the stage and just let you field those directly.
Okay, so when a case of sexual harassment does occur, how should the employer respond? Excellent question. Obviously, there's not a single answer, but some of the key things that work against what I call the permissive culture is that the policies are clear, they are followed, and they are transparent. So when there is a consequence, people should know about it. It doesn't mean that we're going to run people up the flagpole and blast that they're a jerk. But people need to understand that there were consequences, and it can't be a secret, because what happens then is, especially in large organizations, those people just move on to new positions and keep doing what they were doing. And also, it feels futile to the people who make the reports if they don't see anything come of it. So those are important. The story that I didn't have time to read, one thing that was really beautiful about it, the person telling the story said, my manager was able to provide real consequences, but also with empathy and compassion, and provided counseling for that person. In that case, it had been an alcohol-induced situation, and so what's going on in your life that we need to look at so that we can bring harmony and we can all potentially move forward together. So thoughtful, transparent policies are important. And no retaliation, that's huge. You have to figure out how to prevent retaliation. Thanks. Yeah, in the very back, I see someone. I was afraid you'd ask that because the artist in our team is Denise. I have zero artistic ability, and she designed it herself, and everything has meaning. But she told me about it when we first designed it like 9 months ago, and I don't remember all of the meaning because I'm a bad artist. I do know that she wanted to show some engineering symbols, so there's circuits, the star is meant to imply a gear for mechanical engineering, but the star also is a nod to a Native American symbol, but I don't remember the meaning that she was going for with that symbol. And the rainbow color was a little bit of a nod to the diversity idea in a subtle form. So good question. Sorry, I don't have a better artistic answer for you. Yeah, in the back. Things that surprised me. It's a great question. I think it surprised me how much I recognized my own complicity in the situation. So I told you, I kind of come from that time and that place where you had to have a thick skin. And that's kind of my natural makeup because I wouldn't have stuck in engineering from that time if I didn't have that. And I came to recognize how harmful and destructive that is. And in fact, a lot of people will say, oh, if we could just get more women in the field, all these problems would go away. But you know, frankly, a lot of the women who've survived to this point are like me. They're actually just as much trouble as the men. And sometimes more so, because if you show any weakness, then you're putting yourself in that, right? You've got to protect yourself by not putting yourself in that vulnerable category. And so I guess that's it, yeah. But you out there, young men and women, are not going to make that mistake. I trust all of you to change that culture. Thanks. Thank you.